Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I and a host of colleagues find ourselves on a mission of mercy. A mission of mercy, Mr. Speaker, for people who are suffering in Houston, Texas, and the surrounding area. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Congressman Gene Green, the original co-sponsor of H.R. 5025, the 2016 Tax Day Flood Supplemental Act. I want to thank John Culberson, Congressman, for being the first person to sign on such that the bill has become bipartisan. It is a bipartisan piece of legislation. And I want to talk about suffering today, Mr. Speaker, because a good many people in Houston, Texas are suffering for a multiplicity of reasons. I'll share just a few. But before I do this, I want to remind friends and colleagues that tonight, after the Democratic hour and the Republican hour, my colleagues and I will take to the floor to say much more about what's happening in Houston, Texas. But for now, I want to mention the suffering, because suffering can teach us that which we can learn no other way. Some things bear repeating. Suffering and pain can teach us that which we can learn no other way. It's one thing to sympathize, to say, but for the grace of God, there go I, and understand that there is suffering associated with that statement. But it's another thing to empathize because you've had the experience associated with the suffering that goes along with the statement, but for the grace of God, there go I. So in Houston, Texas, a good many people are suffering because they've had their homes flooded, not once, but twice, some even more. They're suffering because some of them were just getting back into their homes and their homes were flooded again. They're suffering because they've lost their means of transportation, the ability to get to work, to sustain the livelihood that causes them to have the ability to take care of themselves and their families. Suffering in Houston, Texas. They're suffering because they don't know what the future holds. They don't know what next year will bring or next month will bring, because these 100-year floods are happening quite regularly in Houston, Texas. So they're suffering in Houston. And I want my colleagues and my friends to know, Mr. Speaker, that this suffering is something that we can mitigate. We may not be able to eliminate it totally, completely, and absolutely. No one can stop all of the flooding all of the time, but there are projects that have been authorized that we are currently funding on a piecemeal basis. They are projects that, if completed, Mr. Speaker, would mitigate the flooding. We have a piecemeal approach to a problem that requires a wholesale solution. There is suffering, and we can eliminate much of this suffering. That which we cannot eliminate, we can mitigate. The suffering I have called to your attention thus far, Mr. Speaker, involves property, real and personal. But I also want to mention the ultimate pain that is being endured by a good many in Houston, and that is losing someone that you love to circumstances that could have possibly been eliminated. 8 lives, possibly 9. I'm told that there may be another. 8 lives lost, Mr. Speaker. 8 people lost their lives to flooding in Houston, Texas. This is in the tax day flood, so-called because it occurred on the last day to pay your taxes. 8 lives lost. The family members of these persons who lost their lives are suffering in Houston, Texas. So I come to the floor with an appeal to my colleagues. We ask that you kindly give consideration to H.R. 5025, the Tax Day Flood Relief Bill that has now some 60 co-sponsors. But it's more than a bill, Mr. Speaker. It's an opportunity to eliminate suffering in Houston, Texas. And I will close with this. I mentioned that suffering can teach us that which we can learn no other way. One of the things that I have learned is that when a storm hits the East Coast and people are suffering, as a member of Congress, I have to be there for them. When we have the tornadic activities and people suffer, I have to be there for them. I thank you for the time, Mr. Speaker, and I want people to remember that suffering will teach you that which you can learn no other way. God bless you, and God bless our great country.